On Monday, 18 September 2023, I unlocked my chambers at Hawthorne Municipal Court on East Mercer Street in Cedar Grove, Ohio at 6:11 a.m. Rain had fallen before dawn, and the brick steps outside still shone dark and slick under the security lights. I was wearing my old navy raincoat over my suit and carrying a paper cup of black coffee the way I always did. I get there before everyone else. I like the courthouse best when it is quiet enough to hear the pipes tick and the old wood settle. My father used to say a judge should meet the building before she meets the people, because a courthouse is not stone and glass alone. It is trust, and trust likes routine. I had been on that municipal bench for 28 years by then, and long before that I had learned the law at my father's kitchen table. He was a lawyer all his life, a gentle man with strict habits and soft eyes. He taught me to read case books and people at the same time. He would stir his tea and say, "Rules without heart become weapons. Heart without rules becomes chaos. Your job, if you ever wear that robe, is to keep both from winning." I carried those words into every arraignment, every bond hearing, every plea agreement, every motion to dismiss, every tear, every lie, every stunned silence that ever settled under my ceiling. My clerk, Denise Harper, met me outside chambers at 6:24 a.m. She had worked with me for 11 years and could tell from the way I held a file whether I was worried, tired, or already angry. She wore her usual gray cardigan and sensible shoes, and she had 3 folders hugged to her chest. "Morning, Judge," she said. "State v. Vail is on at 9. Full gallery. 2 local reporters signed in." I took the top file from her and felt, before I read a word, that odd, small pressure I have learned to trust. Sometimes a file looks ordinary and feels wrong. This one was thin, but it hummed in my hands. The cover sheet listed a string of charges people too often call small until the facts are spoken aloud. Criminal damaging, assault, disorderly conduct, misuse of an accessible parking space. I had seen worse on paper. I had also seen enough to know paper lies by omission. Denise lowered her voice and said, "There's something about this one, Your Honor." I looked down the empty hall toward Courtroom 2 and heard the distant rattle of a janitor's cart. "Yes," I said. "I think so, too." At 6:41 a.m., I sat at my desk, opened the file, and began reading about a rich young man, a damaged lift, a disabled veteran, and a strip mall parking lot at 10:47 p.m. By 7:03 a.m., I already knew I would remember that date. The first time I saw Grayson Vail in person, he did not look like a man arriving to answer for anything. He looked like a man walking into a place he assumed would eventually apologize to him. He was 24 years old, tall, sleek, and so carefully put together he looked almost polished. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit cut close through the waist, a white shirt open one button too far, Balenciaga sneakers so bright they seemed to throw light, and a black Hermes belt with a gold buckle that caught every turn of his body. On his wrist sat a Rolex Submariner with a blue face. In his left hand, he carried a Louis Vuitton portfolio. In his right, loose and easy, he twirled a Porsche key fob as if it were a stage prop and not a key at all. Wealth has a smell sometimes. Expensive cologne, dry leather, certainty. He entered my courtroom at 8:47 a.m. on the dot, 5 minutes after his attorney and 10 minutes before the prosecutor. He paused in the doorway long enough to glance over the gallery and measure it. That kind of glance tells you a great deal. He did not look around the room the way nervous people do, or the way innocent people sometimes do when they hope the truth will hold. He looked around the way a buyer looks at stock. He clocked who might matter to him and who would not. When his eyes finally reached me, he gave the smallest smile, one corner of the mouth not respectful, not warm, just practiced. I have seen smiles like that on men who have always been rescued before consequences touch them. His attorney, Martin Sloan, stood beside him in a smooth blue suit with a silver tie and the steady face of a man who had spent years trying to sand sharp edges off wealthy clients without ever really changing them. Mr. Sloan was good at his job. I respected him even when I disagreed with him, but that morning he had the look of counsel who knows he has a bad set of facts and a worse client. He kept leaning in to murmur things to Grayson, and Grayson kept answering without moving his lips much, like he was bored by the need for strategy. At arraignment on Monday, 14th of August 2023, before one of my colleagues, Grayson had entered a not guilty plea on every count. The transcript showed that when the prosecutor mentioned the complainant was a disabled veteran, Mr. Sloan objected to the phrase as emotionally loaded. Bond had been set at $15,000 unsecured, along with a no-contact order and a direct warning that social media harassment would be treated as a violation. The transcript also noted one other thing that interested me. When the bond conditions were read, Grayson had laughed under his breath, not loudly, just enough for the court reporter to mark a pause. A man's first reaction to a boundary tells me a great deal about whether he sees rules as part of civilization or merely as obstacles. If you have ever watched someone ask for the bare minimum and still somehow carry themselves with grace, hold that memory close now. Men like Thomas Calder do not enter a room demanding sympathy. They enter hoping decency still exists. Thomas Calder arrived at 8:54 a.m. with the prosecutor, Alyssa Merritt. He was 44 years old and moved with that careful, measured control I have seen in people whose bodies no longer do anything for free. His brown sport coat had been brushed clean, but showed a little shine at the elbows. His pale blue shirt was buttoned to the top. His tie had been knotted by patient hands. He used a walnut cane with a black rubber tip worn slightly flat on one side. His left pant leg fell smoothly over a prosthetic below the knee, and the way he sat down told me his back was hurting long before he said a word. Yet he did not carry pain like a banner. He carried it like weather. He had the face of a man who had learned how to keep sorrow organized. Short hair turning silver at the temples, a white scar along his chin, eyes steady, gray, and tired in a deep way. He did not stare at the defendant. He did not fidget. He folded both hands over the handle of his cane and sat as still as if movement itself cost money. There was no show in him. That kind of restraint often moves me more than tears. In a courtroom full of people dressed for performance, Thomas looked like a man dressed for survival. The file told his history plainly, but plain language cannot fully hold a life. Thomas served 15 years in the United States Army, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan. On 3rd of August 2012, outside Kandahar, an improvised explosive device tore through the convoy he was riding in. He lost his lower left leg and came home with nerve damage in his back and right hip that still woke him at night. He retired medically in 2014 as a staff sergeant. By September 2023, he was working 28 hours a week as a night dispatcher for Cedar Grove Sanitation because sitting in a chair with breaks was easier on his spine than standing all day. He was also doing something else, unpaid, that turned out to matter more than anyone in that gallery expected. Every Tuesday and Thursday, and often Saturdays when his body let him, he drove other disabled veterans to medical appointments through the Franklin Regional Veterans Mobility Program. His vehicle was a silver 2014 Ford Transit van fitted with hand controls and a side lift, the kind of lift that needs the striped access lane beside an accessible parking space to open safely. Thomas's wife, Elena Calder, was 42 and living with multiple sclerosis. Their daughter, Rosa, was 13 and had just started 8th grade. They were 2 months behind on their mortgage. Elena's medicine had to be paid in pieces. Thomas picked up extra shifts whenever he could still feel his back at the end of them. What struck me hardest in the victim services notes was not money or even pain. It was pride handled with care. After the incident, when neighbors offered to start a fundraiser, Thomas declined. When a church offered grocery cards, he accepted 2 only because Elena convinced him Rosa needed lunch food more than pride needed protecting. He had never asked the program to mention his volunteer hours in court. He had not told reporters his story. He had not wanted this case to be about hero worship. He wanted his van fixed. He wanted his wife's prescriptions collected on time. He wanted to stop explaining to his daughter why cruelty seemed so easy for some people. The incident itself happened on Saturday, 12th August 2023 at Cedar Grove Family Pharmacy, 811 West Linden Avenue, a small brick storefront in a strip lot shared with a market, a nail salon, and a closed dry cleaner. It was humid that night, 81 degrees at 10 o'clock, the kind of sticky dark that makes even healthy people move slower. Thomas finished his sanitation shift at 9:55 p.m., drove straight to the pharmacy, and pulled in at 10:47 p.m. He was there to pick up Elena's Gladiremer and his own baclofen refill before the pharmacy closed at 11. He needed the accessible space because he needed the striped access lane. That is not preference. That is geometry. When he turned into the lot, he found Grayson's black 2023 Porsche Cayenne Turbo GT parked across the accessible spot and half over the striped lane. Crooked, arrogant, useless to anyone except the man who wanted to avoid walking an extra few yards. Thomas pulled his van behind it and waited because he could see through the pharmacy window that people were still inside. He did not honk. He did not shout. He gave time. That matters to me, because men like Grayson often spend the whole case pretending they were provoked into cruelty by someone else's impatience. Thomas gave him every chance to do the easy, decent thing. At 10:51 p.m., Thomas got out with his cane and walked the 26 feet to the pharmacy entrance. Inside stood Grayson, a friend named Milo Sutter, and another young man later identified as Evan Reese. Milo had a phone with a ring light clipped to it. Thomas waited until Grayson turned and then said, in the same steady tone all three witnesses described later, "Sir, that's an accessible lane. I need room for my lift. Could you move your vehicle?" He was not loud. He was not rude. He was asking for access the law already gave him. Grayson looked him up and down. That detail came from more than one witness. He looked Thomas up and down, taking in the cane, the prosthetic, the tired shirt, the whole shape of a man who had had to earn every quiet thing in his life. Then Grayson said, "Relax, Captain. It'll take me 30 seconds. One friend laughed. The pharmacy technician looked away. Thomas nodded once and stepped back outside. 30 seconds came and went, then another minute, then another. Inside, Grayson bought imported water, 2 energy drinks, and a protein bar while talking about a rooftop party on his phone. If you want to test your own patience against mine, stay with me through this next turn. A person shows his deepest nature in the little extra cruelty he thinks nobody will punish. At 10:56 p.m., Grayson and his friends came out of the pharmacy. Thomas asked again, "I need the lane clear, please." This time he was standing beside his van, one hand on the door frame for balance. Nia Benton, the pharmacy technician, had followed to the entrance because the feel of the exchange had changed. A rideshare driver named Carl Webb had just parked 2 rows over and was watching from near his sedan. Grayson leaned back against the Porsche hood and said, "Man, every space is not a parade in your honor." When Thomas did not answer that insult, Grayson seemed almost irritated that his bait had not worked. Thomas simply said, "My lift opens out on that side. I can't get back in safely unless you move." Carl later testified that he heard every word and that Thomas sounded tired, not angry. Milo Sutter kept his phone pointed loosely in their direction, grinning that grin young men sometimes wear when they mistake humiliation for content. Grayson looked toward the phone, then toward Thomas and said, "You vets milk that limp for everything." Thomas replied, "I'm asking for room, not charity." Even reading that line in the file before I heard it in sworn testimony made me pause. At 10:58 p.m., Thomas returned to the van and pressed the button for the side lift. The aluminum platform slid outward with a mechanical hum into the striped lane Grayson was still blocking. Thomas later testified that he hoped the visible need would end the argument. I believe him. Many people who live with disability spend half their lives explaining things that should already be obvious. He stepped onto the edge of the platform, keeping one hand on the grab rail and the other on his cane. The platform was not fully lowered yet when the Porsche engine revved. What happened next took only seconds and changed the whole shape of the case. Grayson got into the Porsche. The reverse lights came on. The vehicle rolled back 3 feet, then paused. Not a panic movement, not a slip. A pause. Then it rolled back again. That second movement bent the outer edge of the lift, snapped the hinge assembly, and threw Thomas sideways off balance. His cane shot under the van. He went down hard on his right side, striking his wrist and scraping his palm as the metal platform crumpled with a sound Carl Webb later described as a lawn chair being crushed under a truck. Carl called 911 at 10:59 p.m. The audio was in evidence. He was breathing hard and saying, "The guy in the Porsche hit the disabled ramp on purpose. The veteran went down. Send somebody now." Nia Benton moved toward Thomas, but Grayson stepped out of the Porsche first and said, according to both witnesses, "If your toy sticks out that far, don't blame me." Then he laughed. That laugh became one of the darkest sounds in the whole case because it came before he even knew whether Thomas was badly injured. Some people reveal their moral center in the first second after harm. Officer Lena Morales, badge 417, arrived at 11:04 p.m. Officer Peter Dunn, badge 233, arrived 3 minutes later. Officer Morales found Thomas sitting on the curb, sweating through his shirt, right wrist swelling, left knee bloodied where his trouser fabric had torn against the prosthetic socket. She found black paint transfer on the bent aluminum edge of the lift and fresh scraping on the Porsche's lower rear bumper that lined up almost perfectly in height. She asked Grayson what happened. He told her, "This dude set a trap with that thing. I barely touched it." She later wrote in her report that his tone was dismissive and that he appeared more irritated by the delay than concerned about the injured man 10 feet away. The first papers filed after that night tried to keep the case small. On 28 of August 2023, the defense filed a motion to dismiss the assault count, arguing the contact was accidental and that any physical injury came from Thomas's unstable mobility condition. I have read many cold phrases in legal filings. That one sat badly with me from the start. The state asked for a continuance because Officer Dunn's digital extraction of Grayson's phone and Milo Sutter's phone was still pending. I granted the continuance. Another week would not change the weather in that parking lot, but it might let the full truth walk into court on time. By the time trial morning arrived, I had the uneasy sense that the bent lift was only the surface wound. Something in the way the timeline lined up, the no contact condition, the social media warning at bond, the delay in the digital report, all of it told me the real injury might not be visible yet. A lot of people think a municipal court judge spends her days sorting tiny human messes. They forget tiny messes are often how bigger sickness first shows itself. Do not look away yet, because the next pieces came out of a phone and a witness chair, and they changed the air of that room so sharply I can still feel it on my skin. Trial began at 9:03 a.m. when Denise Harper called the case in her clear clerk's voice, and the whole courtroom settled into that formal hush I still love after all these years. Bailiff Sergeant Roy Keene stood at attention near the rail, broad-shouldered and calm as a tree trunk. The gallery was full enough that late arrivals had to stand along the back wall. You could smell rain-damp coats, coffee, and old polished wood. Alyssa Merritt opened for the state with no theatrics at all. She said the evidence would show intentional conduct, humiliation for entertainment, and damage that reached far beyond one broken mechanism. Mr. Sloan responded that this was a parking dispute inflated by sympathy and class resentment. While his lawyer spoke, Grayson checked his phone under the table. Roy saw it before I did. He moved one quiet step forward. I said, "Mr. Vale, put the phone away now." Grayson did not apologize. He placed it on counsel table with the slow care of a man doing a favor for the room. That may sound like a little thing. It was not. A courtroom is built from little obediences. Men who cannot manage those usually fail at the bigger ones, too. Thomas noticed it. I saw his eyes flick down and away, not in fear, but in recognition. He already knew what kind of man he was dealing with. Thomas testified first at 9:21 a.m. He came to the witness stand carefully, took the oath, and lowered himself into the chair with a small, controlled exhale that told me sitting was painful. Ms. Merritt asked simple questions first: name, age, service history, employment, family. He answered each with that same calm tone, like a man laying tools on a table one by one. He spoke about the Army, about the 2012 explosion, about learning to walk with a prosthetic, about night dispatch work, about Elena's illness, about Rosa's saxophone practice echoing through their small house when he came home exhausted. No speech in that courtroom would ever make him look more honest than the way he said, "I do my best to leave enough of myself for the next day." When Ms. Merritt asked what he needed that night in the lot, he said, "Room, just room." She asked whether he raised his voice. "No, ma'am." Whether he threatened the defendant. "No, ma'am." Whether he used his veteran status to ask for special treatment. Thomas answered, "I was not asking for special treatment. I was asking for legal access." Then came the part that stayed with me. Ms. Merritt asked, "Why did you keep your tone calm after the insult?" Thomas looked down at his own hands for a second and said, "Anger costs me more than it costs some people. My body pays for it after." The whole room heard the truth in that. Even Grayson stopped moving for a moment. Thomas then described the second request. The phone pointed at him, the sound of the lift motor, the flash of reverse lights in the van's mirror. and the split second in which he realized Grayson was not making a mistake. He had time to stop, he said. He stopped once already, then he chose again. Those last three words were small and steady, but they carried weight. Choice is the word every court case eventually bends toward. Accidents belong to weather and chance. Courts exist because human beings choose. On cross-examination, Mr. Sloan tried to move the blame into Thomas's body. He asked how many pain medications Thomas was taking that evening. He asked whether balance on a prosthetic can vary from day to day. He asked whether Thomas had been overtired after a sanitation shift. Thomas answered without heat. Yes, pain medicine. Yes, balance can change. Yes, he was tired. But no, none of that caused a parked Porsche to block an access lane or a driver to reverse into a lift. Then Mr. Sloan asked, "Isn't it true you are especially sensitive to being challenged about your military service?" Thomas lifted his head and said, "No, sir. I'm sensitive to people using another man's body for a joke." The gallery went so quiet I could hear Denise stop turning pages. The state then moved in the repair estimate from Calder Mobility Services, dated 14th of August 2023. The amount was $18,740.30. It covered replacement of the side lift platform, hinge assembly, hydraulic arm, wiring harness, rail alignment, and hand control recalibration. The photos attached to the estimate were brutally plain: bent metal, cracked paint, scrape marks, the sort of clean, factual damage that leaves very little room for storytelling. I admitted the exhibit over a weak relevance objection. The law is not confused by plain physics. Metal folds where force meets it. Next came Officer Lena Morales' body camera video. I had reviewed it in chambers, but in open court it hit harder because everyone breathed together while it played. Thomas was visible on the curb, refusing to make a fuss, even as his wrist was swelling under the porch light glare from the pharmacy sign. Grayson stood nearby in a cream bomber jacket over his designer shirt, saying, "Can we not make this a whole veteran thing?" Officer Morales asked him to step back. He answered, "Sure, badge lady." Not enough for a charge by itself, but more than enough to show what he thought of Judy when Judy wore cheap leather boots instead of a Rolex. If you are the kind of person who still believes public space belongs to all of us, then you and I belong to the same stubborn little tribe. We make room for the tired and the wounded, and we do not clap when cruelty calls itself confidence. Nia Benton testified at 10:19 a.m. in light blue pharmacy scrubs because she had worked the early shift before court. She was 31, soft-spoken, and careful not to overstate anything. Good witnesses usually are. She described Thomas as respectful and winded, like his whole day had already been long. She described Grayson as the kind of customer who never looks at your face when you help him. That detail, simple as it was, told me more than some reports do. She said she first noticed tension when Grayson joked at the counter, "Watch this, I parked in the hero lane." He said it to Milo while paying for water. She remembered the words because they bothered her enough that she wrote them down later for Officer Morales. Nia told the court that when Thomas asked the second time for the Porsche to be moved, Grayson looked toward Milo's phone before answering. That mattered. Humiliation was already part of the performance. Ms. Merritt asked whether Thomas sounded aggressive. Nia shook her head. No, if anything, he sounded like somebody trying very hard not to make trouble. Then she described the reverse lights, the pause, the second movement, and the crunch of metal. "It did not look like an accident," she said. "It looked like someone choosing to be cruel because his friends were watching." When Mr. Sloan suggested she was assuming intent, Nia answered, "I'm describing what I saw. The cruelty part was in his face." Carl Webb followed her. He was 52, broad in the shoulders, gray at the beard, and held his baseball cap in both hands as if it gave him something steady to do. He had driven rideshare for 12 years after losing a machine shop job when a plant shut down. He told the truth in plain working man sentences. He saw Thomas wait. He saw Grayson take his time. He heard the insult about milking a limp. He saw the lift extend and the Porsche move twice. When Ms. Merritt asked whether the reverse action appeared accidental, Carl said, "No, ma'am, accidents don't pause and choose." I wrote that down. Judges notice language when it arrives clean. Mr. Sloan cross-examined Carl by asking about distance, angle, lighting, and whether he disliked wealthy people. Carl admitted he was about 28 feet away. He admitted it was night. Then he looked straight at counsel and said, "Sir, I don't dislike money. I dislike meanness." A soft sound moved through the room, not quite laughter, more like recognition. Grayson shifted in his chair for the first time that morning and rubbed his thumb over the bezel of his Rolex. People under pressure often returned to the objects that used to reassure them. His watch was no longer helping. At 10:54 a.m., Mr. Sloan renewed the motion to dismiss the assault count, arguing the state still had not shown intent beyond reasonable doubt. I denied it from the bench. The combination of witness testimony, physical damage, and the defendant's own statements to officers was already enough to carry the matter forward. He asked for a brief recess. I granted 10 minutes. During that recess, I watched the room instead of my notes. Thomas sat alone with his cane between his knees, looking at the floor. He did not whisper to the prosecutor. He did not seek comfort. Grayson stood near counsel table, hissing to Mr. Sloan that the case was turning into a circus. Then, not quite softly enough, he looked back at the gallery and said, "They're eating this up." I warned him then that another unauthorized outburst would place contempt of court on the table. When court resumed at 11:08 a.m., Officer Peter Dunn took the stand to lay the chain of custody for the defendant's phone. He walked the process carefully because digital evidence collapses if you let a single step go sloppy. The phone was seized at 11:12 p.m. on 12th of August 2023 after Grayson admitted he had recorded parts of the encounter. It was sealed in evidence bag CG 234408 at 11:41 p.m., logged into property, transferred to the county digital lab on 15th of August, extracted on 31 August, resealed on 2nd September, and held until trial. Mr. Sloan objected, then withdrew the objection when he realized the certification was tight. I admitted the extraction report. I remember Grayson's face in that exact moment. For the first time, he looked not annoyed, but wary. Then Officer Dunn said the words that changed the posture of every person in that courtroom. 2 deleted videos and 1 deleted Instagram story were recovered from the device. Even before he played anything, the air changed. I could feel it like a drop in temperature. Grayson's hands, which had been loose on the table, came together and locked. "Thank you for staying with the hard part instead of asking for the easy version. Most people say they want truth, but truth is rarely tidy. It asks us to sit still while the worst part unfolds in full light." The first recovered video had been recorded by Milo Sutter at 10:57 p.m. Officer Dunn identified the timestamp and the file path. On the courtroom monitor, we saw Thomas standing beside his van, one hand on the doorframe saying, "Please, I just need the space." Off camera, Grayson's voice answered, "Dance for it, then." There was laughter. Nia Benton closed her eyes briefly when that played. So did I, though only for a blink. A person can sometimes hear the moral rot in a voice before anything else happens. Mockery has a sound all its own. The second file was worse because it came from Grayson's own phone at 10:58:41 p.m. The camera faced forward from the driver's seat of the Porsche. You could see the silver van, the lift easing outward, the striped lane, the soft glow of the pharmacy sign. Milo's laugh came from the passenger side. Then Grayson said very clearly, "Watch me teach him not to block a GT." He lifted his foot. The vehicle rolled back. It paused. Then he pressed again. Metal screamed. Thomas disappeared from frame. Milo shouted, "Bro!" in the delighted way fools do when a cruel plan lands harder than they expected. The clip ended with Grayson swearing and laughing at the same time. No one in my courtroom moved for a full breath after that video ended. The ventilation hummed overhead. Somewhere in the back row, a purse clasp clicked shut. That was all. Not anger then, not even disgust yet. It was something colder. The whole room had just crossed from allegation into certainty. When cruelty is recorded in the speaker's own voice, language stops doing tricks. There was nothing for Grayson's money to soften there, nothing for style to polish, just choice laid bare on a screen. Mr. Sloan rose and tried to call it reckless showing off, not intent to injure. I asked him, "Counsel, what else can the phrase teach him mean in that setting?" He tried to answer, but his own voice lacked faith in the answer. Then Grayson made the kind of mistake arrogant people make when evidence insults their self-image. He half rose and said, "This is insane. It was a joke. You people are acting like I shot somebody." Roy Keane stepped closer. I told Grayson to sit down. He dropped back into his chair, breathing hard through his nose, but he was not done. "This whole town runs on pity," he muttered. "That's all this is." I let the silence hold him for one hard second and said, "Mr. Vail, the next outburst earns you contempt. Sit with your own words." Colonel Shaw had brought records, signed and dated, each page clipped and marked, from Sunday, 13th August 2023 through Thursday, 31st August 2023. 14 veteran transport rides had to be canceled, 9 had to be delayed, and 4 had to be reassigned at emergency cost. The total direct loss to the program was $3,242.11. She read the names only by first initial and last name because privacy matters. But she told the court one man missed a prosthetic fitting, another missed a PTSD counseling intake, and one elderly Marine went 3 extra days without pain injections because there was no way to load him safely. That was the moment the harm grew larger than one parking lot. Then she told us something else. The side lift that Grayson Vail had crumpled under the back end of his Porsche had not been purchased through insurance or some rich donor's casual check. It had been installed in 2021 through a memorial grant named for Sergeant Aaron Pike, the soldier who died in the same 30 August 2012 blast that took Thomas Calder's leg. Colonel Shaw said Thomas almost refused the grant because he did not want his own name attached to anything tied to his friend's death. He accepted it only because he said the best way to honor Aaron was to keep moving other people, she told us. You could feel the room take that in and not know where to place it. The prosecutor asked whether there was any visible mark inside the lift housing tied to that memorial. Colonel Shaw said yes. A brass plaque, 4 inches by 2, mounted inside the left panel, engraved with Aaron Pike's name, rank, and the words, "Still carrying others home." The repair photos showed that panel bent inward. The metal had folded directly across the plaque. Ms. Merritt did not need to say why that mattered. Everyone understood. Some damage is mechanical. Some damage lands in a place paper invoices cannot quite touch. Mr. Sloan objected then and called that detail emotionally prejudicial. I overruled him. The court is entitled to understand the full character of the damaged property and its public use, I said. Colonel Shaw did not gloat. She simply stood there and added one final fact. Thomas had never asked the program to mention any of it unless the court needed the whole truth. He did not want this made larger than it already was, she said. The truth made it larger on its own. Grayson stared straight ahead while she spoke, but I could see the pulse jumping at the base of his throat. The social media evidence we had already seen now changed shape in the room. The recovered Instagram story posted at 11:06 p.m. on 12th of August 2023 no longer showed just a rich young man mocking one injured veteran on the pavement. It showed him mocking the breakdown of a community vehicle, a memorial grant, and the chain of help that vehicle carried every week. The white text on that story, "Local hero wanted VIP parking. Maybe walk it off," felt uglier now than it had 5 minutes earlier because now everyone knew how many people that joke had actually fallen on. The TikTok draft, saved at 11:08 p.m., hit even harder in that light. When Grayson smirked into his own camera and said, "When fake heroes think a limp is a fast pass," it no longer sounded like random cruelty thrown at a stranger. It sounded like a man so sealed inside his own comfort that he could not recognize public sacrifice if it was standing right in front of his hood. Thomas did not move during that replay. He sat very still with his cane upright between his knees, while Elena's folded medical appointment card remained visible in the breast pocket of his coat. If you believe a town is only as decent as the room it makes for people who move slower, hurt longer, and ask for less, then you and I are standing on the same ground right now. Stay with me. The case was not finished teaching that room what harm really looks like. At 11:56 a.m., Ms. Merritt asked to read a short portion of Thomas Calder's victim impact statement into the record, not for sentence yet, but to explain the practical consequences of the van being out of service. Thomas had not wanted the whole statement read. He had written it in plain black ink on lined paper, and it was one of the cleanest pieces of truth in the whole file. Ms. Merritt read only one page. In it, Thomas wrote that Elena missed her neurology infusion on Tuesday, 15th of August, 2023, because he could not secure alternate transport in time and could not safely transfer her alone. He wrote that his daughter Rosa asked him 2 nights later whether some people think wounded men are funny. Then came the line that broke the last little defense still living in that room. Thomas had written, "I did not know how to answer her without teaching her bitterness." After Ms. Merritt read that sentence, nobody moved. Not Denise, not Roy, not the reporters, not even Grayson. The courtroom itself seemed to become a living thing for a second, breathing in and holding it, not daring to let sound break the meaning of those words too soon. I have known silence my whole working life, but that one had weight. It landed on shoulders, it settled in chests. I recessed the matter at 12:04 p.m. for lunch and sentencing preparation after finding Grayson Vail guilty on all counts from the bench: assault, criminal damaging, disorderly conduct, misuse of an accessible parking space. The evidence left no honest room for another result. Yet guilt is not the end of a case. It is only the moment truth stands up. Justice still has to decide what to do next with the living. I told counsel we would reconvene at 1:42 p.m. for sentence after a brief updated recommendation from probation and a restitution schedule. Back in chambers, I closed the door and sat with my cooling coffee and my father's old words. I thought about how often people call municipal court the little court, as if the injuries that arrive there are too modest to matter. They are wrong. Most of civilization is made of small obediences. Who yields? Who waits? Who parks where? Who sees a tired stranger and chooses not to make the day harder? When those little obediences break, what spills out is often bigger than the broken thing. I looked out my narrow chamber's window at the rain-dark street and thought, this case is about access, yes, but it is also about contempt, not legal contempt, human contempt, and that must be answered clearly. I want to ask you something before I tell you how I answered it. If a child looked at you and asked why some people enjoy another person's pain, what would you say without poisoning that child against the whole world? Sit with that. That question stood in my chambers with me. When we reconvened at 1:42 p.m., the room was fuller than before. Word had drifted down the courthouse hall and out into the square. A few people stood along the back wall because the benches were full. The rain had stopped and weak afternoon light pressed through the high windows. Denise Harper called the case again for sentencing. Roy Keane closed the side door, checked the rail, and returned to his post. Grayson had changed somehow in that short break. His Tom Ford jacket was still expensive, his Hermes belt still bright, but the shine was gone from him. Arrogance collapses in layers. First the mouth, then the shoulders, then the eyes. He was not alone now. During the recess, his father, Charles Vail, had arrived and taken a seat behind the defense table. Charles Vail was a man in a camel cashmere coat with a heavy Patek Philippe on his wrist and a face that had learned long ago how to keep emotion from leaking in public. He was the founder of Vail Development Group, a name anyone in Cedar Grove would know if they had driven past the luxury condos north of the river. He did not look at Thomas. He did not nod to me. He looked at his son the way some fathers look at a bad investment. That chilled me more than anger would have. Ms. Merritt spoke first on sentence. She asked for 60 days in the county jail, 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution of $22,482.43, a 1-year license suspension, and 400 hours of community service with the Veterans Mobility Program and Cedar Grove's ADA Compliance Office. She spoke in a quiet tone, not because the case was small, but because quiet words often carry more force than shouting in a room already full of facts. She argued that the harm here was not just bodily and financial. It was civic. He turned public access into private theater, she said. The sentence should restore what that attitude damaged. Mr. Sloan asked for leniency. He argued youth, lack of prior convictions, family support, and what he called performative immaturity. He called the social media evidence foolish rather than malicious. He said jail would be excessive because public embarrassment had already been severe. I listened because every lawyer deserves the dignity of being heard, even when the argument is weak. But there are times when the law must refuse the rich person's old trick of renaming cruelty as immaturity. There was nothing childlike about choosing to reverse twice. Then I asked Thomas if he wished to speak. He rose slowly, leaning on the cane, and turned slightly toward me. His face was pale from the long day, and the edge of fatigue showed in the corners of his eyes. Your Honor, he said, I do not want revenge. I want him to understand that disabled does not mean less. I want the van repaired, I want the rides put back, and I want him to stop looking at people like me as if we are scenery. He said no more than that. It was enough. There is a kind of dignity that refuses to make even justice carry more than it needs to. I asked Grayson if he wished to allocute. He stood. For the first time all day, he looked his age, not because youth excuses anything, but because stripped arrogance often reveals the frightened child it was protecting. He swallowed once and said, I'm sorry this got so out of hand. That was his first version of remorse, and it failed the way half-truths always fail. I asked him, Mr. Vale, are you sorry for the consequence or for the choice? He looked down at the table. His lawyer touched his sleeve. Charles Vale stared at the back of his son's neck. After several long seconds, Grayson said, barely above a whisper, both. It was not enough, but it was closer to truth than anything else he had said. If you want to know whether a sentence can do more than punish, stay with me through the next few minutes. This was the place where the whole day either became a lesson in revenge or an act of real justice. I have spent 28 years trying to know the difference. I began slowly because fast words from the bench can do lazy damage. I looked first at Thomas, then at the prosecutor, then at the defense, then at the gallery, and finally at Grayson Vale. Mr. Vale, I said, this court is not here to hate you. It is here to measure your choices honestly. On 12th August 2023, you were asked for lawful access by a man whose need was visible and whose tone was patient. Instead of making room, you made sport. Instead of yielding space, you used your vehicle like a warning. Instead of helping after harm, you reached for your phone. And when called to answer for it, you mistook accountability for envy and dignity for pity. Denise's pen stopped for a second. Roy stood very still. I could hear somebody in the third row breathing through their mouth. Then I said the line that had formed in Chambers and would not leave me alone. A civilized town is measured not by how it flatters power, but by how faithfully it makes room for the wounded, the tired, and the quiet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room carried the sentence for me. Thomas lowered his eyes. Grayson blinked hard twice and looked away. I sentenced him first on the assault count. 30 days in the county jail with 20 suspended and 10 to serve immediately. On the criminal damaging count, 180 days suspended. On the disorderly conduct and accessible space counts, statutory fines and costs. I placed him on supervised probation for 24 months. I suspended his driver's license for 12 months, allowing privileges only for work, court, medical care, probation appointments, and approved community service. Then I ordered restitution in the amount of $22,482.43 to be paid within 60 days, covering the $18,640.32 repair bill, the $3,842 Boeing 11 emergency program losses, and verified medical replacement transportation expense. That part was law. Necessary, plain, measurable law. Then came the part that made the sentence fit the harm. I ordered 420 hours of community service, all of it to be completed with the Franklin Regional Veterans Mobility Program and the Cedar Grove ADA Compliance Office. No camera, no monetization, no social media posting, no assistance, no substitutions, no use of any veteran's image, name, voice, or story for reputation repair. He would clean vans, assist with ramps and lifts under supervision, repaint access markings, help audit blocked curb cuts and broken sidewalks, and spend enough hours in the company of people he once treated as background that he might finally understand they were never scenery at all. I also ordered him to complete an approved disability access and trauma awareness course, to appear for quarterly compliance reviews in my courtroom, and to remain under a strict no-contact order protecting Thomas Calder and his family. Then I looked at the defense table and added, if personal assets must be sold to satisfy restitution, this court will not weep for a Porsche. That was when Grayson's whole face changed. Not anger then, not even fear, recognition, the kind that arrives too late to stop anything and just in time to hurt. Charles Vale rose half out of his seat and said, Your Honor, surely, I cut him off. Sir, you are not counsel of record. Sit down or leave. He sat. Grayson turned toward him then, and for the first time that day, I saw the truth of the family more clearly than any filing could show it. His father did not look back with comfort or correction. He looked back with distance. Sometimes money raises children in rooms too padded for conscience to form properly. That is not an excuse. It is only a sad fact. I finished by saying, you called this pity. It is not pity. It is proportion. You damaged mobility, mocked suffering, and treated public space as your private stage. So the law will now require your time, your money, your comfort, and your attention to repair, as far as repair can still be made, the exact kind of harm you caused. By then, Grayson was gripping the table edge with both hands. His knuckles were white. His lower lip had begun to tremble against his will. There are moments when reality enters a person faster than pride can contain it. This was one. Roy Keane stepped forward after I signed the minimus for the immediate jail term. The sound of handcuffs in a courtroom is never dramatic to me anymore. It is two small clicks and a sudden stillness. Roy placed one cuff, then the other. At the second click, Grayson flinched. He looked toward his father again and found no rescue there. His face crumpled in slow pieces. First the jaw, then the mouth, then the eyes filled and overflowed. He tried to wipe the tears away fast, angry at them, but once shame breaks open, it often keeps coming. By the time Roy turned him toward the side door, he was crying openly. No one laughed. That mattered deeply to me. A courtroom must never become a place where we enjoy a person's collapse. Justice is not revenge with better furniture. The gallery held itself still. Denise kept writing because records matter most when emotion rises. Thomas did not smile. He sat with one hand on his cane and watched quietly, his face unreadable except for one thing. The tight set of bitterness I had seen around his mouth all morning eased a little, not because a rich young man was crying, but because the law had finally spoken in a language cruelty could understand. If this moment touches a nerve in you, pass this story one day to the parent trying to raise a son who thinks money can replace character, not to shame him, to save him before a courtroom has to finish the lesson. Then something happened I did not expect. As Roy led Grayson past the end of counsel table, Grayson stopped and looked at Thomas Calder, not past him, not through him, at him. It was the first real look he had given him all day. His face was wet. His voice was small. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, not to me, not to the room, to Thomas. That did not erase anything. I would never say it did. But it mattered that the words had finally found the right target. Thomas took a breath before answering. He looked tired down to the bone. "Learn from it," he said. That was all. No lecture, no curse, no victory, just a command from one man to another. Roy led Grayson out. The side door closed with its usual soft latch. The room stayed still for another beat after he was gone, as if everyone needed a second to remember how ordinary wood and air behave after justice passes through them. The rest of the courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters drifted out whispering. Mr. Sloan gathered his files without his usual neatness. Charles Vail left without speaking to anyone. Denise stacked exhibits. Roy moved benches back into line. Thomas remained seated for a moment longer than the others, one hand rubbing the bridge of his nose. When the room had thinned enough to feel human again instead of public, he rose with care and approached the rail. "Your Honor," he said, "thank you for seeing the whole thing." Judges hear thank you words sometimes, and I take them carefully because gratitude can turn a public duty into a personal favor if you hold it wrong. I told him, "Mr. Calder, the law saw what it was supposed to see." He nodded once. Then he said something I have not forgotten. "Rosa asked me this week if fairness is real or just something adults promise children. I think tonight I can answer better." That sentence settled softly in me. I leaned forward a little and said, "Tell her fairness is real, but it needs people willing to stand still long enough to defend it." He gave the smallest smile, tired and honest. Then he turned and walked out, cane tapping lightly over the tile, one measured step at a time. For the rest of that afternoon, I signed orders and heard 2 traffic matters, one theft plea and a landlord dispute that would be all anyone remembered on a different day. That is the strange thing about this work. The world can crack open at 1:50 p.m., and by 2:30 p.m. you are hearing about a fence line and a barking dog. But when I finally went home that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my black coffee gone cold and thought of my father. He would have said the same thing he always said after a hard case. "Did you keep the room equal?" I think that day, by grace and effort both, I did. The first compliance review was set for Monday, 30 October 2023 at 8:30 a.m. By then, the weather had turned sharp. Leaves skittered along East Mercer Street in dry red knots. Probation officer Marisol Kent stood in my courtroom with a file thicker than Grayson's original case had ever been. She reported that restitution had been paid in full on 20th of October 2023, not by an open-ended check from his father, by certified funds traced to the sale of Grayson's Porsche Cayenne Turbo GT and the liquidation of his Rolex through a licensed dealer, both documented in the probation file. I said nothing when I heard that, but inside I felt the sentence settle a little more firmly into the world. Officer Kent also reported that Grayson had completed 62 of his 420 service hours, all under direct supervision. The first 12 had gone badly. He arrived late once. He complained once about the smell inside a transport van after a patient became carsick. Colonel Shaw corrected him in front of everyone and told him, "You are here to work, not curate an experience." After that, the attitude changed. He showed up at 6:30 a.m. the next Saturday in jeans, work boots, and a plain gray sweatshirt with no visible brand names. Sometimes humility begins in clothes before it reaches the heart. Thomas Calder's van returned to service on Tuesday, 3rd October 2023. The repair invoice had been satisfied. The lift functioned again. The brass plaque for Aaron Pike had been carefully removed from the bent housing, cleaned, and remounted inside the new panel. Colonel Shaw sent the court a short letter to place in the file, letting us know that the first ride after repair had been a dialysis transport for a veteran named Mr. Hensley at 7:10 a.m. I remember smiling when I read that, not because a case was over, but because wheels were moving where they were supposed to move again. Elena received her missed infusion 2 days after the van returned, and Rosa made her school band concert on 10 October without having to ask a neighbor for a ride. These are not dramatic facts, if you like your stories loud. But municipal court taught me long ago that ordinary continuity is one of the holiest things the law protects. Medicine on time, school on time, a father able to drive home without feeling like the world thinks his body is a punchline. Those are not small things. Those are life. The case also changed Cedar Grove in ways none of us expected at first. The owner of Cedar Grove Family Pharmacy restriped the accessible spaces and installed steel bollards at the edge of the loading aisle within 3 weeks. The city ADA office, working with complaints already sitting in a drawer, launched a November access audit of 27 businesses on West Linden Avenue and nearby blocks. Curb ramps were fixed, faded symbols were repainted, 2 restaurants were cited for storing delivery crates in accessible routes. A bakery owner called the city to thank them because she said she had never noticed how hard it was for wheelchair users to reach her front door until the audit team showed her in person. That is how change usually looks, not a trumpet, a better ramp. If you are hearing your own life in these details, I want to know what part speaks loudest to you. Is it the father trying not to teach bitterness, the daughter asking whether fairness is real, or the simple painted space that means somebody gets to enter safely? Hold your answer. Stories tell on us when we let them. Veterans Day came on Saturday, 11 November 2023, cold and bright. I was invited to the town square ceremony, but attended only briefly because judges must be careful where they place themselves after a public case. Even so, I saw enough to carry home. The Franklin Regional Veterans Mobility Program unveiled a second accessible van funded by local donations and a matching grant from the Cedar Grove Community Foundation. The new van was not named after Thomas. He would never have allowed that. Instead, the side panel carried a small line under the program logo, "Still carrying others home." Colonel Shaw had chosen the words with the Pike family's blessing. I also learned something else that day from Officer Kent's second report. Grayson had by then completed 148 service hours. He had learned to operate the lift safely, to secure wheelchairs, to fold blankets for backseat riders, and to keep a bucket and cleaning kit in the van for motion sickness without making a face. He had not missed another shift. He had not posted on social media about the case, the program, or his service. His public accounts, once full of rooftop bars, watches, cars, and captions about winning, had gone dark for 6 weeks and then returned in a stripped way, mostly architecture photos and no face. I am not naive enough to call that virtue. But silence can be the first honest thing a vain person learns. On Friday, 12th of January, 2024, something happened that stayed with me almost as much as the sentencing. I had left chambers late and was driving home through a freezing rain when I passed the Veterans Community Clinic on South Porter Road. The lot entrance was backed up because an elderly man in a power chair was having trouble getting from a transport van through the slush to the awning. I was at the light long enough to see a young man in a reflective rain shell step out, kneel in dirty snow without hesitation, clear the chair's path with his gloved hands, and then hold his own shoulder under the old man's elbow while the chair lined up. It was Grayson Vale. He did not know I was there. That mattered most. Thank you for sitting with me through this memory and not rushing past the hard parts. I never forget the people who stay long enough to hear a full truth. If you walk with me again, I will tell you about another day when a woman in house slippers and a grocery apron taught an entire courtroom what courage sounds like when it whispers. Until then, remember this: make room before the law has to tell you to.